Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for being here with us today. My name is Jeff ORLOWSKI. I'm the director of The Social Dilemma and thrilled to be serving as moderator for today's conversation. This event today is the third event that we've done with our Social Dilemma virtual tour, a way for us to continue the conversation beyond the scope of the themes and issues that we brought up in the film and to expand that conversation with our community. I am here today in a gloomy Manhattan, the ancestral land of the Lenape people. Wanted to honor and voice gratitude to the land and the people who have stewarded it throughout generations. And grateful to be here with this amazing group of people for today's conversation, how technology platforms are amplifying disinformation and the threat that they pose to the integrity of our elections and the health of democracy. So I'm excited to bring on today's panelists. I'll introduce them all as they come on. We have with us CHARLTON McIlwain, the NYU Vice Provost and Professor of Media, Culture, and Communications, author of the new book, Black Software, the Internet and Racial Justice, From the Afronet to Black Lives Matter. We have with us CAROLE, CADWALLADR, the Pulitzer Prize nominated journalist at The Guardian and investigator of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. SHIREEN Mitchell is with us today, founder and lead strategist of Stop Online Violence Against Women and the Stop Digital Voter Suppression Project. And Jessie Littlewood is here, the VP of Campaigns at Common Cause. Just to kick off the conversation, I wanted to offer just a little bit of high-level framing for all of us. This is a project that we started in 2017 to make the Social Dilemma itself. And it was a pretty quick realization for many of the people on our team just how complex the set of issues were that we were trying to dive into. I think we've gone from an industry that was, in years past, there was a tech industry based in Silicon Valley that made silicon chips and kind of gave birth to this internet and technological era. And now we've shifted all the way to, we live in a society where countless different industries can use technology, can use machine learning algorithms, and we're seeing the scale and scope with which different aspects of this issue can affect our lives. For today's conversation, we were really wanting to focus in on kind of the immediate conversation at hand with our upcoming election, not just with the election next week, but elections as a whole, and the frame in which the misinformation and disinformation that we see on these platforms is affecting all of us in society. So I wanted to just open up from a broad frame and pass the mic to everybody and just have a chance to both introduce yourself and to talk through what you see as the biggest issue that we're facing with right now with regards to disinformation and the impact on elections. And I think we'll just go through the order on the screen. So CHARLTON, CAROLE, SHIREEN, and Jessie, we'll pass it off to each of you. CHARLTON.
Perfect, thank you. I want to start off by making really 2 points that I think help to put this phenomenon in a historical context, even though we're talking about the present moment. But I want to take us back to raise 2 points, really. To say first that government and technology company collusion to disenfranchise and otherwise thwart Black people's full participation in the democratic process, particularly by perfecting the production and distribution of mis and disinformation, goes back more than 50 years. And so time doesn't permit me to connect all those dots. But one example I delve into in my recent book that you mentioned, Black Software, involves a company called Simulmatics. And just as an example, Simulmatics got its start using computer-based predictive modeling during the 1960 election, parlayed that into numerous contracts with the CIA to develop propaganda campaigns in Vietnam in the mid-60s, and then redeployed those same tactics during the work of the Kerner Commission in 1967 and 8 to understand how to mitigate the threat of Black violence across the country. And so what I'm getting at is that Simulmatics sought to deeply map and understand Black community communication networks, understand where the nodes of trust and obligation existed, understand how both true and false information flowed and circulated from these trusted nodes out into the community. And so this is precisely the kind of networks we see being exploited today, and the practices being enabled by these digital platforms over at least the last 2 election cycles, and particularly to suppress Black votes. And in this election specifically, the vote turnout of Black women. And the second point I will make quickly is to say this, that this history suggests to me that these platforms, as well as our government and regulators, did and should have expected what we are seeing today. The fact that they have not and have not done more to stem the tide makes them not only complicit but responsible for nothing short of the most egregious displays of voter suppression that we've seen in modern history. So I think that's where we're at and that's where we've come from. And my point is, this is not our first rodeo. We've been working at and perfecting this for a very long time.
Awesome. Thanks, Charlton. Carol, over to you. Your big thoughts on what's keeping you up at night and where do you see the problems here?
Thanks so much, Jeff. That was completely fascinating. Thank you, Charlton, for that. That was just really interesting new stuff that I didn't know about, actually. And Jeff, thanks very much for having me here today and doing this panel. And it's been so amazing that the social dilemma has kind of like opened up this conversation. And the thing that's keeping me up at night, I think, even though I'm sitting in London, is just that this election in the US, you're days away from it now. We know that Facebook is already playing an absolutely pivotal role in subverting this election in ways that Charlton talked about, also in the ways that it's allowing this complete mis and disinformation around mail-in voting. It so terrifies me that I've been spending my time organising something called the Real Facebook Oversight Board, because the fact of the matter is, there is no oversight of Facebook at all, and there is no way of curbing its behaviour in any way. And so that's why we've set up. SHIREEN is a member of it also, and it's just essentially just trying to bring public and press pressure to bear in these critical days when we know that every decision that Facebook makes could have real world consequential impact. And we know that it's sort of that get taken by, one man who has overall control of this company. And that I find absolutely terrifying.
Thanks, Carol. SHIREEN, to you.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that that history lesson happened, because I was going to say a little bit about that. Like, this is not new in the context of where we are in America, because targeting Black voters has been a historical framework, and we need to own up to that. I think that what's different and the things that I'm worried about is to see that with the documentation that has come out and the exposés that we've discovered, how that data was used by actual domestic political campaign, should be the things that we are more concerned about moving forward. And even though we're getting most of this information just before the election, my hope is, and my concern is, we're going to look at this and dismiss it moving forward, no matter what the outcome of the election is going to be. But what I was so taken aback by was to watch how many people were participating in trying to deter the Black vote. And it was coming not just foreign, but clear actors in this country. And somehow the message to so many Black voters is that their vote is not important. Yet we have state level targeting of our votes. With what's happening now with the ballot boxes because of COVID, the way COVID is being weaponized with disinformation targeting my community, the way in which that's being used to deter people from voting and how they should or should not be voting, the way in which that language is being used to say that our election integrity is an issue, when all we should be doing is trying to make sure we're making things easier for people to vote instead of harder, and how we're allowing the disinformation, the digital vote suppression, which we work on diligently to try to stop, is that we still don't see enough actions being taken to see this as something serious. If they're overwhelming coming from Black voters, then they're going to go after every other voter they can get if they can be successful at this. So we have seen an uptick in other groups that have been targeted: Native community, Asian community, Latino and Latinx communities. That this is something that has become sort of an American staple to be using this, so much so that, as I am a part of this Real Facebook Oversight Board, we were monitoring the tech hearing yesterday that was days away from the elections, where we have politicians basically trying to get these tech companies to make it possible for disinformation to be allowed on their platforms. That's what that hearing was about. browbeat the tech, the tech executives. By the way, they do need to be browbeat about certain things. Let me just make sure I'm clear about that, but not about them stopping and shutting down the spigot on disinformation. That's the one thing that we should not be doing. And unfortunately, watching politicians hold hearings to make it possible for them to do exactly that. And that somehow freedom of speech is the weapon of choice when our voices, which is why we have unrest in this country right now, is because people are unheard. And the unheard have unrest. And it shows up in these aspects. And instead of seeing that as something that should be done about it, they're being called, and with disinformation campaigns, they're being targeted as if they're the real problem, and not the people who are targeting them. And that includes the politicians targeting their vote. And that includes those who are coming out trying to intimidate them, who are being told to come out and intimidate them, who are organizing on these platforms to intimidate voters who are going out to exercise their right to vote. And so to me, what I look at this in overarching perspective is how there has to be so much disdain for other people's right to vote, to the extent that we will accept this and not do anything about this, and not hold these platforms accountable, as well as politicians.
Awesome. Thank you, Shireen. And Jesse, over to you.
So let me first by saying thank you for this amazing opportunity to learn and listen and participate with some real experts in the field. And I'll be the first to join the chorus in remembering that the history of challenges to democracy, especially as related to technology or computational propaganda, follow a history of voter suppression that's taken place in the United States that's often targeted at communities of color. And the work that Common Cause has participated in through our election protection, nonpartisan voter protection work, including monitoring the social media conversation for mis and disinformation that could disenfranchise voters, follows a trend of tactics and actions that bad actors have used for decades offline. Incorrect information about how you can participate in the election, misleading statements, or attempts to undermine people's faith in the integrity of the electoral process. What's new and what keeps me up at night is, one, that the social media ecosystems have created such an ability to rapidly spread that kind of mis and disinformation at almost zero cost. And that's both the domestic and foreign bad actors. Why not flood the zone with crap, as Steve Bannon might say, or try to put different tactics out there if you can get a little bit of a change in people's perceptions or people's actual behavior when it comes to voting. Two, some of the content that we continue to see in our mis and disinformation monitoring isn't actual problems, but the creation of a perception of a problem that comes with the voting and election system. So these kinds of perception hacks are cheap and easy to create. You don't need deepfake software, and you don't need to go to huge expense to create something that looks like impropriety or something could be funny with the electoral system, when in reality, it's actually above board and oftentimes election workers or election officials doing their jobs correctly. And then I think third, the challenge that we see through the actual impact of mis and disinformation, which is so far this election cycle been largely about mail-in balloting, but now will continue to be about other things, including the results of the election when we get past November 3rd. There's a process by which a cottage industry of for-profit and partisan operatives are using individual pieces of news or examples and trying to create a broader false narrative about it. The issue that we see is that it doesn't just maintain itself within a certain filter bubble or partisan ecosystem, but it ends up getting out into the news feeds of many more people across the country. And then we ourselves share that content to our own communities, sometimes presenting it as a helpful hint or a tip. For example, a narrative about mail-in balloting that was found by the side of the road in Wisconsin ended up being amplified by right-wing media sources. But then in our monitoring, we saw individuals repeating that same claim on the platform next door without noting where they learned about it from. The kicker of that story is that there were no mail-in ballots found in a bunch of mail that was found by the side of the road. So the ability of creating a false narrative that then gets laundered through people's individual news consumption and spread back out, that's new. And that is certainly challenging to our ability to have a democracy where there's an informed electorate and one where both parties and candidates are rooting for voters to be involved instead of saying staying to the sidelines.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. I love everything that everybody brought to the table here. I'm going to try to go into many aspects of this conversation and try to get as much in as we can during this time. But themes around suppressing Black votes, I want to come back to the Real Facebook Oversight Board, as you mentioned, Carol, and the Senate hearing this week as well, just I think is interesting for us to jump into if we have time. But I'd love to kick things off just in terms of what we've learned from the past elections and other research that's been done. SHIREEN and CHARLTON, I'm curious if you can speak more to, for some that might be new to the subject and coming into how voter suppression exists in the digital world. If there are any specific examples you can offer to help the public understand what we're seeing that's unique on the at this time on these platforms. SHIREEN, over to you first.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things we've been tracking. As a matter of fact, when at least 2 weeks before Kamala announced her presidential run, we saw disinformation already spreading about her. That disinformation is still in existence now that she's VP, but it was clear even before her announcements came out that they were already trying to dismantle her presidential campaign. And in some ways, I feel strongly that part of the reasons was an impact of the reason why she got out before we got to the first primary was because the level of disinformation that was targeting her in her campaign. Much of it was focused on her identity, which is, in what I call the birtherism 2.0 phase. We saw this type of behavior also on local races, questioning other people's citizenship, so their right to even run for office, which we saw run constantly with Kamala. The other things that I want to make sure that from a historical framework in terms of what we see now that's connected to what was going on in 2016 is that, this conversation, there's different groups using this terminology, but this was something that was seeded by Russia in 2016, that both candidates are the same. When we saw this still happening, even now in 2020, we saw this happening before there was even a Democratic nominee. So the disinformation was already in the ether, out there to be weaponized and to be used. Nobody.
It looks like we're having some technical connection concerns there with SHIREEN. I can't hear you on my end. We'll just keep moving on. And CHARLTON, do you have any thoughts to add to this?
Yeah, and I think SHIREEN was headed in the right direction in identifying, the clear examples of what's been transpiring both in the 2016 election, but up into the president. The one that I keep coming back to in the president election is that display of what scholars and researchers have now started to call digital blackface, and that was this campaign on Facebook and other networks that sought to build trust. And so here were people who were not African American, who put on the persona of African Americans and built over a period of time trust with Black voters, Black women voters in particular. And then ultimately, over a period of time of building that trust of constant messaging and communication between folks that you thought you knew, folks that people thought were people like them, Black folks, etc. Then came the messaging about, well, what about Kamala, and is she really different than Joe Biden during that primary time during the election? Is there really a reason to vote for her? All of these messages that sought to drive a wedge between Black voters and among Black voters. And part of that was about the gender split. And all of it was very much in line with and consistent with what we know about the electorate, who goes to vote, in what volumes, that turnout. And one thing that was clear about the specific targeting in this instance is we know that Black women are the most loyal voters for Democratic Party candidates. They turn out in higher volumes than any other demographic within the African American community. And so this was a specific targeted attempt to draw on pre-existing networks of trust to then erode and shave off some of that vote percentage amongst both African American women, but then drive a wedge between African American women and men in ways that would help suppress excitement about the candidates, excitement about Kamala Harris, excitement about Joe Biden, and the prospect of voting itself. And so these are some of the things that are real examples, are targeted examples, examples that show the care, the deliberateness, the energy spent into cultivating these things that's happened over a number of years. And hopefully SHIREEN's back to come back in on this conversation.
Awesome. SHIREEN, if you want to just we lost the last little bit of what you were saying there.
Oh my goodness, technology. I apologize, everybody. This is the one thing we're talking about. And I heard CHARLTON talk a little bit about about the way in which Black women are targeted, and that's one of the reasons why what I was talking about in terms of Kamala, why it was so important to even track what was happening to her specifically, because when we started to see what was happening to her, we knew that that was going to continue, and we are still seeing some parts of that going into 2020, where now her Indian heritage is being used in applications like WhatsApp and things that that in comparison were aspects that were still focused on her identity. So in the division in between East Asian or other aspects of Asian heritage is now being used to tell people not to go vote for Biden or Harris. We're seeing that type of disinformation as well. But when we were talking about the Black vote, what we saw with these exposés, which is really important, was the way that that data was used in detail to target Black voters, not just through social media in general, but in ways in which they were going to get their personal data to use that as weaponization. And the examples that I want to use that I said before about both the same, I've said this before because people tell me that there's no impact about disinformation. And I've said over and over again, there is. And the reasons that there are and the examples I share is what happened in 2016 with Michigan. We know, as we just said, about the history of trying to stop Black people from voting. There are always poll taxes. There's aspects that we've seen with moving polling places. We're looking at now the way they're trying to target Black ballot boxes or how the vote by mail. But that people made it to the polls, got to the ballot box, and didn't vote top of the ticket. In Michigan alone, 90K people did not vote top of the ticket. In Detroit, it was 70K people, a predominantly Black environment, i.e. urban environment. And he won that one state by 11K. And what I see now, that was both the same messaging campaign, disinformation campaign by Russia that has been used domestically in various ways. I've seen it come from different groups of people, though, where the target still is to say both candidates are the same to deter Black voters from electing anyone from either party. And I think it's important that people understand that it morphs and has changed. We have way more domestic actors than foreign actors, and that's something that we need to address. But things like telling people now with COVID, giving people the wrong information about how to vote by mail, right? For telling people that how they should vote on their absentee ballot, when in essence all we want them to do is vote and send it in and make sure they sign it. But giving each state has different regulations, but we've seen different ways, which we saw back in 2016, where images were going out telling people they could text their vote. We're now seeing other aspects of what they're telling people they can and cannot do in terms of how to exercise their absentee ballots, and also trying to discredit the balloting system as well. So we've seen a broad swath of this, and I just want to make sure that people understand it's still going on, and we haven't seen any legal actions or even regulations to kind of stop this from the platforms as well as from officials that are participating in this.
Mm-hmm. A lot of what you're hinting at here, and we're getting to, are the different ways in which disinformation are appearing on different platforms, migrating from platform to platform. Jesse, as you were getting at just a second ago, you were talking about perception hacks. And this is something that has been really top of mind for me around our information ecosystem, how we as a society get our information at scale in countless different ways, and how these social media and search platforms now have in many ways fundamentally shifted and disrupted the information ecosystem as a whole. To go to some of the conversation that SHIREEN was referencing in terms of the Senate hearings from yesterday, so much of the conversation seemed to be about how do we clamp down on content moderation. And I'm wondering if we're having the right conversation there or not. Like there's a stat that we have in the social dilemma that falsehood spread 6 times faster than the truth on Twitter. And if we have information ecosystems in these platforms that are spreading lies faster than truth, is the idea of content moderation just an endless catching up that we will never ever get to the root cause? So I'm curious, Jesse, maybe we'll start with you, and then Carol, you can jump in right afterwards. Curious your thoughts on, are we asking the right question around content moderation? The way these systems are designed, they're based on the Section 230. I'm throwing a bunch of things at you, but Section 230 and this notion that these platforms can just allow anything to be published and they don't have to take responsibility. Are you concerned about our ability to hamper down on disinformation itself?
So I think it's been shown pretty clearly that there is a challenge in the platform's ability to respond to disinformation. And that's been shown through the coronavirus pandemic, as well as the challenges we've had in disinformation targeted towards the process of voting in elections. Now, I think the conversation about content moderation is one that puts us in a reactive frame, and that's a challenge. I think the conversation should be focused a bit more on the challenge of algorithmic amplification and what happens when you're able to not only produce content on a platform, but have that content show up in front of other folks who may not have asked for it in the first place, and see how it transmits and goes around very, very quickly. And part of that challenge is because we know that bad actors will manipulate those systems. And again, the examples we've already heard of foreign powers like Russia in 2016 coming to attack our democracy through using the power of amplification of content and gaming the systems are one. But just a couple months ago, Turning Point USA was sanctioned by Facebook for creating a troll farm of domestic teenagers in Phoenix, Arizona, who are putting out disinformation around the voting and elections process. So we haven't learned enough, certainly from the 2016 example, to prevent this from appearing on platforms today. And it's also a real challenge to think that all of this is happening from a foreign power. I think that if we're serious about solving the problems of mis and disinformation on the platforms, you have to look at the business model and about how the amplification is core to that. And you also have to look at the role that we play as consumers and producers ourselves. As a publisher ourselves on these platforms, we also need to understand the responsibility we have to validate sources and to make sure that we aren't accidentally spreading mis or disinformation, and instead lead our community towards more trusted sources of information.
Carol, do you have any thoughts you'd like to add to
that? Lots of different thoughts about so much interesting stuff being brought up. But I suppose, one of the things which strikes me about it is that a lot of the time we talk about politics, or we discuss what's going on in the election, etc. We're having these conversations in what feels like a public space. We feel that we're having these, conversations openly with our friends, with our neighbors, with random strangers, but we're having them on Facebook or on Twitter or on Instagram. And these aren't public spaces. These are private spaces. They're private companies. And actually, to go to the thing that Jesse was talking about, is that we feel that we're sort of swimming around in this sort of, very transparent medium where we can see what's going on. And actually, we can't see what's going on at all. We're swimming around in what essentially is toxic sewage, in that is the nature of these platforms. They are riddled with this kind of toxic lies and propaganda, stuff planted by foreign states or, domestic bad actors. And one of the most I think the most difficult thing to get over to people and for people to understand, and I include myself in that, is that you don't know what you're seeing. You don't know who is planting this. You don't know who these accounts are. I thought the thing that CHARLTON was saying about digital blackface and the lengths that people are going to there was absolutely fascinating. But it just, I think very early on when I started looking at this, there was a Danish defense analyst who I spoke to. And I said to him, what do you say to people when they say, well, it's all well and good, but, it's nothing to do with me. And I'm not, I don't, it's all, I can see that there might be stuff going on. But in my world where I'm just, exchanging puppy photos with my family, I really don't think that's an issue. And he was just sort of like, if you think that you are not being targeted, you probably are the target in a way. And it's like, this is, he was just sort of like, good luck with it if you think that this doesn't affect you, because it affects all of us. And, it is just, I find sort of this astonishing thing to think about, which is that the idea that we are swapping, our way of communicating with families and friends is also the exact medium by which a foreign nation state is looking to undermine our democracy. Now, it's such a massive thing to try and get your head around. And we've got this fundamental, I think, kind of cognitive dissonance about it, because it is too big to grasp. And it's too big to grasp when it's the thing on our phones that we're looking at. And that's the thing also which is going to affect the outcome of this election. These are really, really big concepts, and they have taken over our lives in just a space of just a very, very few years. And so it's kind of, we're really on the sort of nursery slopes, I think, of even starting to see this, let alone understand it, let alone do anything about legislating to protect ourselves, because at the moment we are totally unprotected, and I think that's what is the most worrying thing. I'll let somebody else.
Yes. CHARLTON, do you want to add something? Or
yeah, just a small point to your question about content moderation, and to underscore the things that Carol mentioned and Jesse, as well as SHIREEN, that as long as content moderation is held up as an example, we're always going to be chasing our tail, as it were. Things change so rapidly, we're locked out, and these are not transparent platforms or systems. So I think absolutely those are not answers. And I think we have to look for answers in much more systemic and structural ways when we think about the questions that Carol just mentioned about legislation, about regulation. SHIREEN made the point that the conversation amongst public officials is tipping towards that First Amendment and censorship. And I think that goes to show that we have to disrupt the very business models in which these things operate and see these companies and platforms differently. They are becoming huge parts of our democratic and electoral infrastructure, and they deserve then to be regulated that way. We should demand that kind of transparency, and those are the kinds of things that you can't get from content moderation, which I think colleagues of mine like Sarah Roberts, who wrote the book Behind the Screens and give insight into the world of content moderation. Not only are we put behind, but we put certain people at risk by exposing them to certain kinds of content day in and day out. And those are typically the usual suspects in terms of people of color and people who are poor and et cetera. So just wanted to chime in on that to say, Hardy, content moderation is not the answer.
Yeah. There's also a great film called The Cleaners that is about content moderation through the social platforms as well. Shout out for that movie. We were just talking through, and I wanted to bring it back to the business model points that both Jesse and CHARLTON were bringing up. One of the things that we saw when working on this project, some people reference this as a climate change of culture. And that was a phrase that really hit me. I think, as many know, our past works with Chasing Ice and Chasing Coral were all about climate change and the different consequences to different ecosystems that we see as a result of this one systemic practice. And the references here to this business model, this attention-seeking, advertising, micro-targeting business model is one of the things that we always felt was like the core that is driving all of these different consequences that we're seeing in different parts of our society. I wanted to pivot us with that in mind to, so what do we do about this? Right, so this huge challenge around solutions. And what I'm curious about is very much if you had a magic wand and you could do anything at the legislative level or at the level of code within a company, what would you wish to change? Like, what are the things that are top of your mind in terms of these are the first steps in terms of solutions? Charlton, if we can start with you, then we'll go around the circle.
Yeah, what comes first to mind, really, to me, is something like the Voting Rights Act, which, of course, we have been eroding its impact and its position within our legislative framework for years now, with huge kind of whittling away recently with the exclusion of whole sections that prop up our ability and the government's ability to confront states and bad actors who want to suppress votes, who want to make it difficult, particularly for people of color, to vote. So I think one of our starts really has to be thinking about this not simply from a technology standpoint, thinking about it not just as a problem about technology and what technology exists and gets used for these purposes, but to think much more fundamentally about a institutional type of practice and treat it as such. And I think we start with where can we protect our basic right of enfranchisement, our basic protection to the ballot box. And that should be our focus. And we should fold in these questions about platforms and technologies within that. And I think the more we stay on the turf of this is a tech company, or even this is an advertising company, and we're going to deal with them as such, these things stay divorced from and disconnected from the real issue around voting rights, which I think is what is central to this conversation.
Awesome. Carol, if you could wave a magic wand and implement legislation or change some code, what would your wishes be?
I find these questions really hard to answer because I'm not a policy person, but I was just thinking about it then, and I was thinking, what would I like? One thing I would really like is I would like individuals to be held accountable. So directors, senior executives to be held responsible for what happens on their platform. So I find it impossible to believe that the United Nations found that Facebook played a determining role in a genocide. Tens of thousands of Rohingya in Myanmar were killed, and there was a determining factor was the inciting posts on Facebook. Now, Facebook has never been held to account for that. It's never faced any consequences. And so it's just, there's been no accounting. And similarly for the 2016 election in America, it is unbelievable to me that, this years of research by painstaking investigation by the FBI and by the Senate Intelligence Committee have, got chapter and verse on how Russia attacked America using Facebook, using Facebook's own tools. And there has been no consequence at all to that. And so this is why we're in this position days away from another election. And who knows what's going to happen this time. And the same thing for exactly the thing that Charlton and SHIREEN spoke, so movingly about. The fact that Facebook's own tools are used to deprive Black and minority communities of their vote, and again, has faced no consequences. And so that is happening all over again. So I just, it's only, I think, until individuals are held to account for this stuff that we're actually going to see any kind of real change.
Right. They have the privileges of a publisher without any of the responsibilities of a publisher, and they fall in this weird zone and seem to get away with a lot. Jesse, to you, if you could change legislation or code.
Well, I think my first step would be to put CHARLTON and CAROLE in charge of the regulatory tools to be able to bring these platforms to bear. I think that would putting not only the real Facebook oversight board, but make it the oversight board that Facebook is accountable to, and in a proactive perspective instead of the way that I understand it works, which is as a reactive review of past decisions. So in other words, I think the platforms right now aren't playing to win in terms of solving the issues that they've been confronted with. And they've used the changes to advertising systems or press releases that claim their content moderation system have removed so many challenging or misinformation posts as a way of getting away from the kind of accountability that Carol spoke to. I think a simpler step, so maybe my magic wand is less powerful in this scenario, would be to have transparent policies that are enforced consistently across different communities and across different use cases. The platforms have previously claimed that publishing those kinds of rules would allow bad actors to game them and manipulate them. Certainly hasn't stopped gaming of their system currently. And it doesn't really fit with the kind of challenges we have today, where with a robust civil society group, a network of organizations, we could actually play a stronger role if the platforms were more clear and consistent on how they plan on enforcing not just disinformation and misinformation policies, but hate speech or ways that they enable the mobilization of hate groups or groups on their platform.
I'm curious, I want to hop over to you, Carol, about the real Facebook Oversight Board. I'm curious how this came about and what the hopes and intentions of this group are. Also, why Facebook in particular, not the inclusion of Twitter, but what are you hoping for this organization and this group to be able to apply pressure? How so?
Well, so I mean, essentially, it was a sort of desperate measure. Essentially, the real Facebook Oversight Board, and it came out of some conversations we had with the members of the Stop Hate for Profit coalition, who, when the Black Lives Matter protests erupted, there was this sort of overwhelming disgust, really, at Facebook refusing to take down Trump's post. When the shooting starts, the looting starts. And so you have this, the platform just totally failing to enforce its own policies. And this very troubling relationship, really, with Trump and the White House. And so we had conversations with them, and it was just this thought of trying to create something which brings people together and amplifies the voices of these experts and academics and civil rights leaders who can see very clearly what is going on and have been articulating these problems but are not being heard. And the thing about Facebook is it spends an enormous amount of money on comms and PR and crisis comms and lobbyists, and it gets its talking points out. That is all. And but there is no sort of organized central point for the people who have been saying this is really harmful, it's really disturbing, and particularly in this context around elections. I mean, that's very much been where my focus is. And I come out of it, I mean, the reason why Facebook is because Facebook, 3 billion people around the world use Facebook's products. It plays an absolutely pivotal role in every single election in every country in the world. And there's absolutely no means whatsoever to hold it to account. And for me in particular, there's a couple of really key moments. And one of them was that Mark Zuckerberg repeatedly refused to come to Britain to answer questions to our parliaments. And then what happened is 9 different parliaments in 9 different countries banded together and asked him to come and answer these questions about disinformation and fake news. And he refused to come to any of them. And so I think it was just this sort of realizing that, you know, Facebook is more powerful than our own nation's parliaments, that there is not a single body, you know, not a single government or law enforcement agency or regulator who kind of had any oversight or power over it. And really, what do you do with that? And it's a fundamental sort of philosophical existential problem which we have to reckon with. And so the real Facebook Oversight Board is really about amplifying the voices of these experts and trying to bring pressure to bear, because the only thing that we've ever seen Facebook or any of these tech companies respond to is public pressure. So that's the sort of the lever that we're looking to exert.
Absolutely. We have just a few minutes left as we wrap up today's time. And what I was hoping to get from everybody as kind of a closing thought is, what brings you hope right now? What is giving you that sense of inspiration and continuation that's allowing you to keep doing the work and keep your own motivation in these trying times? Jesse, over to you if you want to kick things off.
So what brings me hope is seeing how many Americans are participating not only in the process of our election through voting. We've had just historic levels of early voting happen in these past few days, gearing up to the November 3rd election, but also participating in ways that both on social media and off can help others participate in our democracy. So our Election Protection Coalition works to train and recruit individuals who want to volunteer to be nonpartisan election protection volunteers. And either they're there at the polling place helping voters understand what their options are, or they're answering a hotline with legal questions, or they're part of a team that I help run, which is scouring social media for mis and disinformation around voting in elections that could disenfranchise folks or have them undermine their faith in the integrity of the election. And we've seen an outpouring this year like never before. In 2016 and 2018, we recruited about 5,000 volunteers across our program. We already have over 40,000 volunteers this year. People are stepping up like ever before. And this social media monitoring program to combat disinformation around elections and voting has just made a huge impact. We've already identified over 5,000 pieces of disinformation that the platform that we've reported to the platforms. And we've also helped track a bunch of key narratives that we think are the most damaging ones, and use that in combination with our voting rights experts to create positive content that we ask members of the public to share. We've also seen more elections officials, like secretaries of state offices, lean into the challenges of online disinformation around voting and elections and really play a key role in pushing back on those. So there is a big movement afoot and building now to continue to build power to not only ensure that everyone who's eligible can vote, but also that we are identifying and understanding the problems of social media when it comes to disinformation and building the power it'll take to hold them accountable.
Awesome. Thank you, Jesse. CHARLTON, what's bringing you hope these days? What motivates you for this work?
Yeah, and I'm hopeful is not usually a adjective that people associate with me, but I think if anything, it's doubling down on what Jesse mentioned. It's seeing not necessarily the long lines, but seeing people willing to stand in those lines to get their opportunity to vote, to do that early, to say, I'm not going to take any chances. I'm going to make sure I show up and that my vote is counted. I remember hearing yesterday a statistic, I think that was from Texas, about senior African Americans going out to vote in record numbers. And so seeing that kind of participation, seeing folks who are basically saying, look, I'll be damned if you stand in my way from this fundamental right. And I don't care about the misinformation, the disinformation, the folks that are trying to thwart my will and my rights. I'm going to make sure to do what it is I can do to participate. So I love that, and that's what motivates me. I am not fortunately with, or unfortunately with, Common Cause, but also am signed up to do voter protection, and been going through some trainings and hearing that there are 1,600 people on a Zoom getting trained and getting ready to go out, and so I think that unprecedented levels of folks and outpouring, just saying, look, I want to be involved in this democracy in ways that we have not. And my hope is that this carries over. This election is going to come next week. It's going to be over. In 2 years, there's going to be another one. In 4 years, another. And so my hope is that this energy, this momentum continues to really make for the groundswell movement that we need to make the kinds of changes that we need to make in this country.
Absolutely. I guess my question should have been, do you have any hope? And if so, but Carol, over to you. What is there anything that is bringing you hope these days, or what keeps you motivated for the work that you do?
Well, actually, I have to say, I was so stunned when you told me yesterday, Jeff, that 38 million people had watched The Social Dilemma around the world. That does give me hope, because I just sort of think, it's amazing that there's that interest in this subject, and there's been an increase in knowledge that now people have around the subject. And I think the fact that also as well, the fact that particularly in the US context, that people are understanding the role that the platforms play in politics and in our elections is really, really key. And my real hope about that is that we understand that this isn't just one election. It's really pivotal. It's really consequential what's happening in America right now. But 5 days after the US election, there's another election in Myanmar. I mean, this is happening in all elections all across the world. But these are American companies, and they only pay any attention to American media. And so there's this real thing, I feel, which is that we need this allyship. We need the American public, the American media, to really grasp these subjects, so that it can also, the rest of the world has got some sort of voice, some outlet really for getting these changes that they also need. And I think that is happening. I think faced with this really, really, critical moment in American history, that people have woken up to that, and they can see how in other places, the way that this plays out in places like India and Sri Lanka and Brazil, and the way that we know that the platforms have been used in really, really harmful, anti-democratic ways, that, we now have to do something about that, really. So there is a bit of hope there, I think.
Thank you so much, Carol, for those thoughts. We unfortunately have lost our connection with SHIREEN, so we won't be able to hear her closing thoughts right now, but just wanted to voice gratitude for her joining today. And just as we wrap up, we'll be sharing a slide on the screen in just a little bit around different calls to action with all of the different groups and organizations from which you heard from today. With the Facebook Real Oversight Board, there's a campaign to tell Facebook to do your job by ensuring that their platform does not undermine elections or incite violence. You can volunteer with Jessie and the Common Cause Election Protection Coalition. SHIREEN and her organization has a grassroots effort to collect real-life experiences of digital voter suppression. And you can deepen your understanding of the democracy dilemma by exploring CHARLTON's work at the Center for Critical Race and Digital Studies. Our team from The Social Dilemma just wanted to say thank you to all of the panelists and to all of you tuning in today for this conversation. There are more resources on our website, thesocialdilemma.com, so you can get tuned into the next stop on our virtual tour and the events that we'll be hosting. Where you can also sign up to host your own event with The Social Dilemma, and you can register to receive tools, resources, bonus clips like the one you saw today. So thank you all so much for joining, and thank you very much. Have a great day.